So, hi everyone. You're gonna be talking about the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. So we are Camila Ardila, Michael, and me, Eugenio. So these are the contents we're gonna be covering throughout the whole presentation. And this is a brief introduction. So the ISAD model is what puts together the labor market, the goods market, and the financial market on a single model. It is used to explain short-run fluctuations and at the same time their effect on the long run. So the IDAS model, the aggregate supply curve carries the effect of output on the price level. It is basically the labor market using the Phillips curve, which is the relationship between unemployment and inflation. And on the other hand, the aggregate demand curve captures the effect of the price level on output, and it is driven by the ISLM model. IS being the goods and service markets, and the LM being the financial markets. So aggregate supply in the long run. Long run means long enough for pretty much anything to change. But in macroeconomics specifically, the long run means long enough for all prices to fully adjust to any kind of change. So for example, suppose the price of gas goes up so much it takes a really big chunk of money out of your budget. But it is Monday and still you've got to go to work. So the short run is how would you react on that Monday. And in the long run is however it long to takes for you to adapt to that price shock. So in the medium long run, output is determined by the economy's stock of labor, capital, and natural resources, and on the level of technology. An increase in price does not affect any of those. That is why the long run aggregate supply does not shift. It is vertical because the potential output an economy can produce isn't related to the price level, as I have stated before. There are only two things that matter for potential output: the quantity and the quality of a country's resources, and how can it combine those resources to produce aggregate output. When an economy is producing at its exactly full unemployment output, the rate of unemployment is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. It is important to highlight that this natural rate is not zero. So the long run aggregate supply curve is also vertical at the full unemployment level of output because this is the amount that will be produced once prices are fully able to adjust. So the long run aggregate supply can shift as I have stated before if there's a changes in natural rate of unemployment such as immigration, changes in capital such as investment in factories, changes in natural resources such as the discovery of new mineral deposits, and changes in technology, so improvements on technological progress, new inventions, etc. So the short run, the aggregate supply curve shows the total quantity of goods and services firms produce and sell at any price level. It is also important to highlight that everything that shifts the long run aggregate supply also shifts the short run aggregate supply. So the supply side shocks are factors that cause changes in the cost of production and shifts the short run aggregate supply curve either outwards or inwards, such as changes in wage rates, change in the cost of raw materials, change in indirect taxes or subsidies. In the short run of the aggregate supply, if it slopes up, then shifts in the aggregate demand do affect output and unemployment. Short-run fluctuations in output and price levels should be viewed as deviations from the continuing long-run trends because prices will end up at the same place. Also, expected prices shift the short-run aggregate supply. If the expected prices, workers and firms set higher wages. At each price, production is less profitable, output falls, and the short-run aggregate supply shifts to the left.
So hi, now we're talking about the aggregate demand curve. So the AD curve is represented by the downward slope, and it is expressed as the total amount of money exchanged for goods and services at any given price level and period of time. Aggregate demand consists of the four main components, which sums up the total GDP, and the components are the consumption, investment, government spending, and the difference between exports and imports, giving the exports. As we can see on the demand curve, on the horizontal axis, we have the real GDP, and on the vertical line, we have the price level of the economy. So now let's answer the question, why does the aggregate demand curve has a slope facing downwards? So the fundamental principle of AG curve sloping downward is because of the three main effects. The first one is the wealth effect, which holds the relation with real wealth and consumption. Then we have the interest rate effect, which lies in the relation between the interest rates and the investment. And finally, there is the exchange rate effect, accounting for the relationship between the price level and the net exports. We can see that an increase in the price level in the economy will result in a negative effect on the output base, so that the wealth effect falls and the interest rate falls, and the exchange rate will also do that. Okay, so the shift of the aggregate demand curve occurs for other reasons other than the price level. Overall, increased confidence in the financial market will increase the investment of aggregate demand and therefore shifts it to the right. So the changes in the in investment in this example is based on the confidence level of the investors. Another way it can shift leftward, for example, when government spending is decreased, and it can be, for example, lower budget on military defense or school, which will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Now there is, we can see there is a relationship of a AS and AD model in equilibrium. So the intersection of aggregate demand curve and the short run aggregate supply curve determines the short run equilibrium output and the price level. Based on the Keynes interpretation, once the economy reaches the full employment level, we can say that the economy is in a long run equilibrium. Unemployment is also it's a natural rate, and the total output equals the price level. Now we have the causes of economic fluctuations. We can define the fluctuations in the economy as the shocks of exogenous changes in aggregate supply or demand, which could temporarily push the economy away from the full employment. So there are several steps on analyzing economic fluctuations. First is to determine whether the event shifts AD or AS curve, then whether the curve shifts left or rightwards, and the ADS diagram to see how the shifts changes in output GDP and the price level in the short run. So an example can be the oil price rises. So in this case, the short run aggregate supply will shift to the left, and there's going to be stagflation from A to B, describing the falling output and the decrease in prices.
Now, regarding the stabilization policy. These are policy actions aimed at reducing the severity of short-run economic fluctuations. In order to implement this stabilization policy, economists can opt for either fiscal or monetary policies. Fiscal policies are those that include government spending and taxation, and monetary policies are those that include money supply and interest rates. These policies can only affect aggregate demand. So as we can observe on figure 3, there's an AD growth from AD1 to AD2. This can occur because of, for example, an increase in government spending, which would be a fiscal policy. Now, looking at the stabilization policy in a more complete graph, which is the one we have at the right, there is an adverse shift in aggregate supply from AS1 to AS2. Because of this, policymakers who know that they can influence aggregate demand are going to try to shift the curve right from AD1 to AD2. This would move the economic equilibrium from point A to point C. This policy would prevent the supply shift from reducing output in the short run. However, the price level would rise permanently from P1 to P3. Now, looking at the economic shocks and policies together, the first scenario we have is a contraction in aggregate demand. So firstly, there's a decrease in aggregate demand, for example, because there's a decrease in consumption. Therefore, the curve shifts to the left. Because of this, the equilibrium point would go from point A to point B. Over time, the short-run aggregate supply curve would shift as well. It would shift to the right, and therefore, output returned to its natural rate in point C. However, there has been a decrease in price from P1 to P3. Now, looking at an adverse shift in aggregate supply. So firstly, short-run aggregate supply falls, therefore the curve shifts to the left. Secondly, policymakers can accommodate the shift by expanding aggregate demand, so for example, by reducing taxes. This would generate the price level to rise further, so it would go to P3. And lastly, they would keep output at its natural rate, so it would stay in point C. Finally, we're going to give you a real-life example, which is called pricing the pandemic. So, as you can observe, there has been both supply and demand shocks in this scenario. The demand shock is triggered because consumers are being fired, therefore they do not have the same disposable income they used to hold before in order to consume. Additionally, supply is not being fulfilled because not every job can be performed at home in either the manufacturing or the services industries. Because of this, there is a significant drop in GDP. However, the impact of prices depends on how these shocks move in relation to each other. If both supply and demand fall by equal amounts, you could potentially have a scenario where equilibrium prices settle at the same level as before the crisis. This would be the case of both circles. However, if one of them is stronger than the other, then there could be a decrease in output or an increase in price. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please let us know.